Welcome back, everyone. Over to you, Nicola.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our presentation, Enactment of Contemplative and Inclusive Practices in Blended Work-Based Executive Education Programs. My name's Nicola, and I'm co-presenting with my colleague Amy today. We're both senior lecturers and degree programme leaders in executive education at Newcastle University Business School. And for those of you who may not know where we are geographically, we're located in the northeast of England in the UK. Amy and I are really interested in developing blended social learning as a way to enrich the learning experience for work-based learners to enhance their professional practice. Amy.
Hello, everyone. Our interest in contemplative and inclusive learning comes from many years combined experience in executive education. There's a tendency in this type of work-based learning to give primacy to transmitting content and pay less attention to the context of the learners and their learning journey, and also to pay less attention to the processes of learning and application to the real world of work. We aim to develop macro-level awareness, which takes place when learners become critical by developing questioning skills and encouraging those they work with to question the normative assumptions of their workplace.
So we're really focusing on how learning becomes meaningful in relation to individual practice and organisational contexts to enable immediate and relatable application to learners' professional practice. And we make really clear links to the Sustainable Development Goals within the content of our programmes. But for us, inclusive and contemplative pedagogic practices really contribute to SDG 4, quality education, and SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. So for us, it's about highlighting the importance and impact for what and why and how we do what we do.
So we're using the work of Tracy and Assad to frame this presentation, and this quotation encapsulates why we have become more creative and experimental with contemplative and inclusive pedagogic practices and place them centrally in our teaching and learning approach. Our programs take learners on a particularly demanding 2-year learning journey, and the pandemic heightened this and continues to do so as they wrestle with the impact of that on their personal and professional lives. And these practices that we're going to share today move learners beyond feelings of impotence to a place of hope. And we incorporate often unnoticed elements of executive work by inviting in-depth contemplation of the emotional and embodied nature of leadership, coaching and mentoring, and invite reflection on the whole of the learner's experience into the learning sphere as material to inform their learning.
So just to give you a bit of a context to our work, whilst you all might be familiar with the term executive education, we often refer to our learners as lifelong learners who study part-time and are all work-based. So the programs that we've designed blend theory into practice, whereby we have weekly curated course material on our virtual learning environment that provides structured online guided learning with monthly on-campus session delivered in one-day blocks present in person. And this is where the in-person social learning and sense making of the material occurs most prevalent. We had the luxury and the privilege pre-COVID to design these programs from a blank page. And as I'm sure you're all familiar with, we too pivoted entirely online in their launch year in 2020-21. But this really allowed us to understand how to enable engagement that would be sustained across the lifetime of the program, mindful and appreciating that all learners during this context were in the same storm, but actually we all had different vessels and we wanted to create an equitable experience. And the programs that we are going to talk about in today's presentation that are included are 2 MSc programs, coaching and mentoring in strategic leadership, and the level 7 senior leader apprenticeship. And just to provide further context, the programs that we deliver to generally have small cohorts. So just to provide a context, that 30 in a cohort is our ideal. But whilst they are small, all of the practices that we're talking about today are still applicable for larger cohort sizes. So to begin with, we're going to talk about inclusive leadership principles. And inclusion for us is a shared value of the executive education team at Newcastle University Business School. It's been a golden thread that really runs through all of the programs. Therefore, what we do and how we do things within the learning ecosystem of the learning experience is really important to us. In terms of what do we mean by inclusion? Inclusion is never an achieved state. And I'd like to share an example, an analogy that we developed and worked on for one of our continuing professional development learners. And they shared with us that they thought inclusion was a bit like exercising. And we exercise to become fit. So thinking of inclusion as fitness really enables us to think about inclusion as never being static and always something that requires effort. And drawing upon an understanding of inclusion from Oswick and Noon in 2014, we are concerned with the processes that incorporate differences into business practices and thereby help to realise the value. So for us, inclusion is core to the knowledge content within the programmes as well as the value. So how do we do this? Well, it's about proactively facilitating belongingness for all stakeholders in the space, whilst also ensuring that we value individual uniqueness. And that's not easy, and it's very difficult to try and achieve, but isn't it worth trying to do? And that's what we thought. So we wanted to create a sense of high value belongingness for individual learners, so that where individuals are treated as an insider within this learning community, that they align to the norms and the way things are within this in the learning spaces that they're a part of. And what do we mean by creating this high value uniqueness? It's about individuals being able to share and show their unique characteristics and the contribution that they can make in this learning community. So inclusion for us occurs where the simultaneous enactment of both high value belongingness and uniqueness, when an individual learner can be part of that insider learning community, but allowed and encouraged to retain their uniqueness within this space, this learning space.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the contemplative element of this presentation. So what is a contemplative pedagogic practice? And contemplation involves making a space for observation and gazing attentively, either literally or metaphorically, externally, whilst also introspection, which is internal attentiveness, noticing what is occurring within. And this enables learners to connect knowledge and action for the good of the world, real world problems and solutions that require personal involvement, focused attention and deep understanding, connection, compassion, creativity, personal meaning and insight. So if you look at these bullet points on the slide here, really we're talking about all of these strands which are really important for executive education, values, choice and decision making, future application to human systems or interactions with clients, co-workers and teams, things which can be enriched by observing more attentively and seeing differently, which links directly to inclusive leadership principles. These are the elements that we're trying to encourage by contemplative pedagogic practices. So next, we're going to share some examples from our programs of inclusive and contemplative practices.
Thanks very much, Amy. And in relation to people and thinking about when, where and how we ensure voice and visibility for our learners, we did think carefully about this for a particular module, and I'm going to provide a particular example for you. So a module that we were delivering, which incorporated 3 different types of work-based learner, MSc learners, apprentice learners, and continuing professional development learners. Some of the learners in this particular module knew one another or had been at least part of the institution before this particular module had begun, and others were joining for the first time. So we had to think carefully about how we would land with all 3 different types of learners at different points in their learning journey with us, and how would we deliver this module orientation. So we decided to use the online space for the first module orientation session. And the reason being was that in a Zoom space, we all land in a box, and that Zoom box can be quite a leveler for everyone because everybody arrives in the same size box on a screen, and they can manage how much of themselves they reveal within that box to control their own visibility. Also, as educators, it allowed us to manage voices in the room quite easily with particular online protocols, which we shared in advance and reminded learners of during the session. So, for example, when and how we use mute, inviting people to speak by raising their hand, etc.
So Nicola's talking about some quite high risk practices that we use in the way that we engage our learners in order to enable them to examine their work practices. And in using contemplative practices, we think a lot about giving people the opportunity to do that individually, and online tools enable us to give people what they need to do that on an individual basis. So one of the things we do at the beginning of the program is to give everybody a physical learning diary when we meet them in person, but we throughout our online material we have a particular icon for a learning diary which reminds them to write reflectively in their learning diary, and we have a wide range of individual reflective practice activities that we thread through the digital asynchronous learning, which allows them to engage in those processes in private, flexibly according to their own needs. When we ask learners to share their reflective practice with each other online, we do that in, again, we start by doing that in a low risk way. So we might use visual methods such as choosing a metaphor to capture a reflection on a coaching or leadership identity through Padlet as a tool. So choosing a metaphor is you can choose how you want to belong and how you want to be seen in an online space, rather than using your photo or something very personal. A metaphor is a way of filtering your choice and allowing you to be visible in whatever way the learner chooses.
So in terms of place, which is the second slide that we want to share with you in terms of these practices, we're thinking about how you onboard and the mix of learners within a particular activity and technique that we use called practice knowledge exchange. And in the module that I mentioned on the previous slide, we incorporated practice knowledge exchange because this is a technique in which we create space in a session, online or in person, for learners in groups to design and facilitate an activity to enable the sharing of practice knowledge amongst the cohort and the academic team. And in this particular module, this was focused on particular wicked issues. So we, as the academic team, provided a number of wicked issues for learners to select, and they selected from preferences from 1 to 3. And this really enabled agency. So they had a choice. It allowed them to have a say and a voice in which wicked issue they would like to be part of in terms of that design and facilitation of. But also it ensured for us as educators that we had a diversity of wicked issues because we had control of that. But we also, whilst we gave them a preference, we could control and make sure that there was diversity of learners within and across groups. But the activity of practice knowledge exchange itself really enables voice and visibility for learners. It destabilizes the traditional power dynamic within the learning environment. So it really shifts away from the academic team within that space in that activity. So it gives that power, it really shifts that power, and it gives the learners the voice and visibility in that moment. And that transcends and moves often beyond the practice knowledge exchange activity that we might be doing, and sets the tone for the continuation of a module.
So there is a lot of choices for us as educators in these practices, and one of the choices I have about place for some of the work I do with contemplative practices is, where do I first introduce? For example, I use mindfulness practice with learners in order to bring them into an emotional and body awareness of what's happening for them. I also use a 20-minute creative visualization of their learning journey for them to situate themselves within their own learning, to understand where they've been and where they want to go. I first do those kind of practices in person in a group setting, because that actually creates a lot of connectivity between me and the learners when I'm doing it. And then I provide them as online recordings for ongoing individual practice development. And in the first iteration of doing them live, I give the learners permission to take part only in any or all elements that feel safe to do so. And then within each practice opportunities to gently disengage. I highlight that as I'm going through. And actually, the feedback that I got from learners in the live sessions was that some of them chose to disengage. It wasn't a good time for them to be using those practices, and actually they'd feel safer and easier returning to them online, which is actually, I was thinking about recording them, and then I did record them and put them online. And I think they've really found it in a way, once they've got an idea of what I was doing, easier to engage with those online recordings than they did in person. So next, we're just going to focus on some of the processes that are going on within the learning and how this connects with what we've just been talking about. So the processes that we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about how contemplative practices engage the emotions and body through the limbic system, and then Nicola's going to give an example of how she connects through meaning making to purpose and action. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research into contemplative pedagogic practices, which demonstrates that whilst they connect with emotions and minds of the learners, they actually improve cognitive learning as they regulate the limbic system, which is our emotional and hormonal brain patterns, and lead to deeper understanding and appropriation of course materials. So these are not soft practices, they're practices that really enable a higher level of cognitive learning, as well as all-person learning. They also help with student anxiety, which is something we know is on the increase. So meditation and mindfulness can be used for psychological well-being, self-regulation, positive emotional states, and decreased stress. Go over to you.
And the second example, which relates to that second point in terms of the meaning making, is a practice example of we during COVID in the first year of the launch of the programs, what we decided to do was to create summary videos, record summary videos as academic teams after any live sessions. So this was really as a result of the pivot to a wholly online delivery due to COVID-19. So we just thought if anybody was to miss an live online session, we would be able to capture the essence of the session in an online recording. And just to know what we never actually record a live session. That is part of the psychological safety that we have within our programs and for our learners, given the work-based nature. So this is why we decided to do the recording. But what we soon realized that as academic tutors, we were engaging in contemplation about the sessions. We were doing and recording these summary videos, role modeling, contemplative sense making, and also providing an inclusive resource for learners to consume flexibly. And we started to notice that the views of the videos far exceeded the learners who may have missed the session due to an illness. So we asked the learners who were actively using these videos, you know, what purpose, how were they using them? And it was basically for consolidation of learning. So it's important to note that in some of the practices that we're sharing with you today, Amy and I, some of our practices might have been planned and conscious choices, but sometimes these are emergent from our own practices. And it's not to discount that and to just share the kind of organic and evolving nature of those.
So I guess that brings me to the issue of psychological safety, and we recognise that learning about leadership, coaching and mentoring on our MSCs as specific workplace practices is emergent, processual, embodied, a social process, a process that is context specific and power laden. Therefore, we consider when to use contemplative and inclusive practices with transparency for the learners. So we highlight what we're doing as we're going along. So I talk about this is a contemplative practice and why I'm using it before I'll introduce it into the learning, or we're doing this to highlight inclusive practice that you might want to take forward in your own work context. And whilst we thread some low risk activities in semester 1 of year 1, such as reflective writing and as I've articulated, sharing metaphors for leader or coach identity, in semester 2 we move into greater experimentation, only when the learners trust us, their peers, and most importantly themselves with this type of learning experience. And we really follow, as Nicola has shared, their feedback about what's working, how much more they want things, how much less they want. So we're in constant dialogue with them around what feels right, what feels safe for them in that moment. And you have to be ready to respond and change tack if you're getting signals that something doesn't feel well, they just won't, particularly on the online space, they won't participate if they don't feel safe. So that's direct feedback for you in that way. So finally, we just wanted to share with you the value and impact both to our learners and to us of these practices. So over practicing these, over particularly the first year of these MSc programs, we've seen transformative learning in terms of creating the connection, the learners creating the connection between theory and application into practice, which we see embodied in their lived experience. They tell us about this, they write about it in their assignments, and we also see them present back to us. For example, both MScs have deep dive learner facilitated on-campus sessions where they teach back some of the material that we asked them to think about, and the depth and the depth to which they take that has really blown us away, and they live and breathe the content and own it as part of their identity. And we believe this is because of the facilitative nature of the practices that we've shared with you today. Nicola, over to you.
And just in terms of the value and challenges of these practices to us as educators, there are positives and negatives, like with everything. So that it does enable flexibility of learning for learners and for us. It develops our practice as educators, which, as I'm sure we've all found, particularly in the context of the last 2 years, has been a huge upskilling. But it isn't always easy, and particularly when we reflect on this as teaching teams, when we think about how this works for us to enable psychological safety, it is tricky, and it can increase the amount of time that we take in making choices and the consideration. And also in the live online space or in the present in-person space, acknowledging the blend, we can be vulnerable. So it really depends on your relationship with the colleagues that you deliver with, the subject that you're delivering on, and how much time you've spent in terms of reflecting on the pedagogic choices that you've made. So it's a tale of two halves. So to finish and in conclusion, we've shared the principles of inclusive and contemplative pedagogy, and we've shared how we've enacted these principles through people, place, and processes, some of which were planned and conscious choices, and some that were iterative and emergent from the context in which we were in and the practice. And what we would like to do is invite you now to incorporate inclusive and contemplative practices in relation to people, places, and processes within your learning environments.
So with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much for coming and listening to our presentation, and we're very happy to answer your questions. We've got a couple of references to the text that we shared with you in the presentation too.
Thanks. And we do have, I think, 7 minutes for questions, and there's a couple of questions in the chat already, which is great. The first question: what percentage of your cohorts online were UK based and international? That's a really good question, and actually I think probably can be answered fairly due to the context that we were in. So these programs initially pre-COVID were actually designed to be regional programs to attract a regional audience, and obviously the context in which we were in enabled us to attract and change the way that we delivered significantly. So I would say at this moment in time, in answer to your question, the percentage of those that are international is low. It's primarily, and Amy might correct me, but nearly all 100% UK based. For those who are on the apprenticeship program, it has to be UK based, but for other programs, the MSCs, not so much. But we're still probably thinking about and catching up from a marketing perspective about how that could be, how we can extend our geographic reach as a result of the pedagogic pivot. that we have enabled with these programs. So I think there's a lot more to be done. So it's a low percentage now at this moment in time. Do you want to comment on that, Amy, at all?
No, I think we were specifically tasked when we designed these programs, and as Nicola said, we have the luxury of designing programs from scratch, which is very rare in an academic's life. So we were asked to design programs for the regional northeast of England market because Newcastle University felt that it was missing a contribution actually to the local economy and local executive education. So we started with that in mind, but a lot of people have talked to us about whether we would run it a purely online version of these programs, whether we'd run them bite-sized online, and whether we would extend internationally. And we have international interest in the programs, but currently we're not actively marketing to those areas.
Another question we've got: excellent concept for mature students in exec ed, but how can any lessons be learned for bigger cohorts in undergraduate programs? So I suppose one of the key aspects that we wanted to share was about the practice piece, because although the principles, and we talk about and acknowledge our privilege of having that blank piece of paper to design these programs, but some of the practices that we've shared can be quite small and little in terms of where and how you attune to enable voices in a room, whether that's an online learning environment that's live, or an asynchronous session within a discussion board. How do you enable other voices to participate in a particular space? So depending on the type of session with the large cohorts, whether that's seminars or lectures, it's thinking about which are the practices that could be utilized in terms of how can I just increase the range of voices in a room? How can I increase the visibility of particular learners? And it's those questions that are the practices that we challenge each other and ourselves as educators to see what and how we could do to make a really small change. It's not about making, rewriting a module necessarily. It's thinking about how we do and what we do, and whether that could be slightly changed or tweaked. Amy, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I suppose I think that all of the individual reflective practices that we put online are very simple. Actually, we do a lot of reflective templates, as I say, visual activities where people share if they want to, or encouraging people to be reflective and reflexive throughout all of the online material, because I think what we tend to do is to, as educators, is to get very into our content and throw a lot of content at people without thinking about how do they process it. So we have, if we have a page of content in a week's learning, because our learning is released weekly, if we have a page of content, we'll probably have 2 pages of guiding people through reflective activities in relation to those that content, an article or a video that they've watched. We'll then guide them through reflection on the back of that. And I think that's something that's been extremely powerful. So when we don't have a lot of time with them live in person, so I think all of that could be adapted for any size group.
And we've got 3 more questions in 2 minutes, so I'll see what we can get through. And please do, if we have to cut it short, link in with Amy and I, and more than happy to continue conversations. But the next question is, from your experience with exec education, how much emphasis do you put on developing analytical and critical capabilities of learners? And B, how do you measure that? I'm going to answer these really quickly. Is that we place a great amount of emphasis on developing analytical and critical capabilities of learners. And I think that's probably one of the central aspects to the academic personal tutoring role that we have within these programs, much more than I would say than we have previously. And in other programs, there's a lot of academic upskilling in terms of that. In terms of how we measure that, there aren't particular metrics that we use other than what we see through formative and summative assessments. Amy, do you want to quickly comment on that? Or?
That's fine, you've done that beautifully, thank you.
The next question, I'm really going against the clock here. Give me an example of a specific assignment so I can really understand the process of how inclusiveness was done. So I'll give one particular example in relation to assignments. Is we embed, as Amy mentioned in the presentation, critical reflexivity throughout the program, and that is nodded to in every assignment across the program. So we have particular reflexive, not reflective diaries, and we're constantly asking learners to think about that in relation to collaborative leadership and collaboration, inclusion specifically, so we're very overt with that, and also in relation to relational aspects of connecting. And I'm sorry, I think we've run out of time now, but like I say, please do connect with Amy and I and continue some of these conversations. It's been a pleasure to speak again at HS Talks.
Thanks, everybody.